Hey guys, sorry I'm a few minutes late here to get our evening session of our Bible study going. I got a new laptop and I was trying to get it going and ran out of time, so sorry about that. Anyway, welcome to lesson 2 of our study on giving up something bad for Lent. And today our topic is give up harsh, condemning judgments for Lent. And the scripture for today is Matthew 7, verses 1 through 5. I'll give you a second if you want to find that in your Bibles, if you've got one with you or on your phone or laptop or whatever. Matthew 7, 1 through 5. It reads, "Do not judge, or you too will be judged. For in the same way you judge others, you will be judged. And with the measure you use, it will be measured to you. Why do you look at the speck of sawdust on your brother's eye and pay no attention to the plank in your own eye? How can you say to your brother, 'Let me take the speck out of your eye,' when all the time there is a plank in your own eye? You hypocrite! First take the plank out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to remove the speck from your brother's eye." So James Moore, who's the author of this book study, he starts chapter 2 with the story about a young lady named Ellen. And he writes that she was a junior in high school, an honor student, member of the band, and secretary of her class. Her life was beautiful, her future bright, but then everything went wrong. He says, "I was called on to conduct her funeral on what would have been her 17th birthday. It was a suicide. In the depths of depression, she had taken an overdose of sleeping pills. She left a note saying that she couldn't go on. She couldn't fight the rumors and the rejection any longer. She felt betrayed by her friends and her community. It was all so sad and so useless. Such a waste. This tragic teenage suicide was sparked by a misunderstanding, by a false rumor, by people spreading vicious gossip. Ordinary people like you and me, passing on a cruel, destructive untruth. The rumor was that she had come home at daylight in a drunken stupor, her clothes disheveled, delivered to her door by an older man in a fancy sports car. That was the rumor. But the truth was that she had sat up all night at the hospital with her gravely ill grandmother and had been brought home early the next morning by her uncle. That was the truth. A neighbor saw something out her kitchen window and had jumped to the wrong conclusion, and as a result started spreading a false rumor. And with that, an innocent teenager was devastated. The harsh stares, the cruel jokes, the profane wisecracks, vicious gossips whispering behind her back and pointed fingers, and of course the blatant lies became too much for Ellen to handle. She may have been strong in school and things like that, but she had a sensitive personality and she just couldn't take it. And she cracked under the pressure. And in a moment of deep agony and excruciating emotional pain, she took her own life. A young life that was filled with so much promise was snuffed out because people like you and I participated in spreading false rumors. And when are we going to learn? As far back as the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus warned us about this in Matthew 7, chapter 7, verse 1, when he says, "Do not judge so that you may not be judged." This isn't a suggestion. It's not a request. It's not a plea. This is a strong command. It's an order, if you will. I mean, Jesus is speaking pretty straight here. He's not mincing words. He's not beating around the bush. He's coming on strong, and he is giving this stern warning. Do not judge. Now, obviously, Jesus knows that we have to make judgments. We have to make decisions. I mean, we make hundreds of them every day when we decide whether we're going to stay in bed or we're going to get up, whether we eat oat bran for breakfast or eat biscuits and gravy, whether we stay home or we go to church, when we pick this book to read or that book to read, or we opt to buy this instead of that. All of that time, we're making judgments. We have to make value judgments and moral judgments. As a matter of fact, Jesus gave the Sermon on the Mount so that we might have insights and standards by which to make Christian decisions, Christian distinctions, and Christian judgments. Common sense tells us that we have to make those kind of judgments constantly. But of course, these kind of judgments aren't what Jesus is talking about here in Matthew 7. If you look in the dictionary and you look up the word judge, it's a verb, and it means to decide or to distinguish. There's also another definition, though. To judge means to condemn or to censure. And that's what Jesus is talking about here. In fact, this verse could almost be translated into condemn not so that you will not be condemned. So let's look at it a little bit closer at some of the strong lessons that we can find in Matthew 7. First, we want to avoid making hasty, condemning judgments based on rumor. Jesus' command to judge not is a warning against making hasty, condemning judgments on the basis of rumors and hearsay. We need to beware of the rumors. Jesus' warning here is clear. It's against gossip, because this is the stuff that heartaches are made of. How often do we injure persons when we start or repeat a rumor or make a judgment without checking all the facts? Think back to when we were kids and we learned that rhyme of sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me. Boy, I think we've all pretty much found out what a lie that was. Words hurt. And our worst hurts don't come from those sticks and stones. They come from words. Words can rip us apart. They can knock the very life out of us. And the pain that we cause, the hurt that we can do with our sharp, piercing, and stinging words of rumors and hearsay and gossip, it's indescribable. Before we make our estimate about any event, any happening, any person, we need to wait. We need to wait on the facts. We need to wait on the truth. And we need to wait on time. I want you to think back to the days of the cowboy matinees at the local theater on Saturday afternoons. It's amazing how often the mistake to rush to judgment was highlighted in those old westerns. A stranger comes to town, something bad happens, and immediately the local citizens are pointing that finger at that new stranger in town as the likely culprit. A stranger would be arrested, he'd be put into jail to await a fair trial, which would come later down the road because, the traveling judge had to make it all the way from Dodge City or wherever. But the locals, they didn't want to wait. And they became a lynch mob. And they would march to the jail and they would demand that the sheriff hand over the stranger so that they could have justice immediately. And they could purge their town of this evil stranger. But the sheriff and his deputy, if you remember, they'd stand on that front porch and they'd have their arms crossed and their shotguns laying in the crook of their arms and everything. And they'd hold off that angry mob. And the sheriff would say, no, you can't take justice into your own hands. You just have to wait. Judge will be here in a couple of days. We'll have a fair trial for this accused man. And he'd send him on home and tell him to just wait for the trial. So reluctantly, the crowd would disperse. And then a few days later, the judge would arrive and the full truth would come out. And the stranger, of course, would be proven innocent every time. At that point, we need to be looking at the fact that it's dangerous. It's dangerous to rush to judgment without all of the facts. And that's what these people in these old Westerns would do. They were rushing to judgment just because the person was a stranger in town, that they were the one that was causing the problems. You know, it's a dangerous thing to jump to conclusions without all the information. It's a dangerous thing to make quick, hasty, condemning judgments based on rumors and hearsay. There's a great group called Rotary International, and they strongly advocate for what they call the four-way test. It's like a four-way stop sign, okay, where you've got 4 cars all stopped. Well, so anyway, it's excellent, and it works like this. Before you say anything or you pass anything on, you need to ask yourself 4 questions. First, is it the truth? Second, is it fair to all concerned? Third, will it build goodwill and better friendships? And fourth, will it be beneficial to all concerned? Those are 4 really good points. Now, I shared a different one with our youth group, and I want you to envision the word think, okay? And so you ask yourself, before you speak, is it true? Is it helpful? Is it inspiring? Is it necessary? And is it kind? Think. If you can't answer yes to these questions, then you shouldn't say it at all. Jesus calls all of us to be a gracious spirit when he says, judge not. First of all, he wants us to beware of the rumors. And then the second lesson that we can take from this is to avoid being unkind and unsympathetic in our judgments. So Reverend Moore tells this story of when he first started out in ministry. And I really can relate to this because he also started his ministry in a really small country church. And he said, I served a church in a small town way out in the country. And the little town had a grocery store, a service station, a feed store, a cotton gin, a church, a post office, a washateria, a school, and a few hundred people. And that was about it. Now, I have to kind of laugh because the town that he first served in, he had more than I had in the town that I first served in. I'll never forget my first appointment. I loved it, but we had even less than that. But anyway, every morning, Reverend Moore would talk that he had to walk over to the post office to get his mail. And every morning for 2 years, old man Charlie Smith would be sitting on the porch of the post office, and he'd be whittling away. Okay, he'd just be sitting there every morning whittling away. And so every morning as Reverend Moore is walking by, he'd kind of look, and old Charlie Smith would be cutting his eyes over towards Reverend Moore, and he'd say, nothing against you yet, preacher. Nothing against you yet. I can only imagine. And he says, that always filled me with an unsettling rush of mixed emotions. And I can totally see that. Because on one hand, you're glad that, there was nothing against him yet. But on the other hand, you were waiting for that other shoe to drop because he was always looking for something. And James Moore says, he goes, I waited for 2 years just waiting for that other shoe to drop. And I knew it was going to. But then he also said, deep down in my soul, I longed for kindness, for compassion, and for support. I wanted them to be kind and merciful and gracious in their judgment of him. Isn't that what we all want? I mean, don't we all look for grace and mercy? Not just from Jesus and God and people like that, but from all of those around us. There was a guy named Sam who went to go have his picture taken, and he said to the photographer, and I'm sure some of y'all can relate to this. It's like, all right, find my good side. I want you to do me justice, Mr. Photographer man. And the photographer took one look at Sam and he said, well, Sam, what you need is mercy, not justice. I think we all probably need that. But it's also something that we often forget. It's pretty easy to jump on the bandwagon and criticize other people harshly just because everyone else is doing it. Bashing others has become something of a fad in our time. And it's pretty sad to say because it's not just kids that are doing it. Politicians, personalities, groups, and even friends judge one another with harsh words and merciless criticism. But then we come upon the Sermon on the Mount. And Jesus brings us up short and he says, judge not, condemn not, be gracious and merciful and compassionate. So first, we need to be aware of the false rumors. And second, we need to be aware of being unkind. The third lesson that we need to learn and we need to remember is that our judgments may boomerang. Y'all know what the boomerang is, right? You throw it and it spins around and it comes back at you. Yeah. Well, we need to be aware of the boomerang effect because our harsh judgments can come back to haunt us. What we send out can come back. And we see this over and over again in the scriptures. The elder brother in the story of the prodigal son, the elder brother judges the prodigal brother harshly. And the elder brother is the one who misses out on the party and he ends up coming out looking bad. And then we have Mary and Martha. Martha judges her sister Mary harshly, and Martha ends up being the one that's embarrassed. It's the way it works sometimes. Our harsh judgments can boomerang on us. And so we have that prayer. Lord, make my words sweet and tender today, for I may have to eat them tomorrow. I'll say that again for you. Lord, make my words sweet and tender today, for I may have to eat them tomorrow. Something good to remember for all of us. Bishop Bob Goodrich wrote a book called Look at the Burning Bushes. And in it, he tells the story of a schoolmaster some years ago who demanded strict discipline in his classroom. Now, when I read this story, it reminded me of the strict teacher on Little House on the Prairie when Miss Beadle couldn't handle the older boys in class. They were being bad, and so they called in this strict teacher. And this story reminds me of it just a little bit. So this strict schoolmaster required that when students would recite from their textbook, okay, he would call on them to read something out of their book, and they had to stand, and they had to hold their textbook in their left hand as they stood to read, okay? So early in the term, one young boy stood holding his book, but he held it in his right hand instead of his left hand. And the teacher interrupted him with a stern reminder that he needed to be holding his textbook in his left hand. But the student continued holding it in his right hand. Well, teacher wasn't going to have any of that, and he exploded. He shouted at the boy, and he said, "You take that book in your left hand right now, or you suffer the consequences." And the boy started to explain, "But sir, I can't." And the teacher became so infuriated that he actually ran to the student, and he's screaming at the top of his lungs, and he's shaking him, and he says, "Don't you disobey me." And as he's shaking him, he pushes the boy harshly back down into his desk. And that's when the teacher sees the empty shirt sleeve swing into view. The boy was holding the book in his right hand to read because he didn't have a left arm. That whole sleeve was empty. And the teacher was embarrassed, and he stammered out an apology. But there's two really important lessons that we can learn from this story. And the first is that everyone has an empty sleeve that we can't see. And maybe if we knew about it, we would be more understanding and less critical. But we're not always going to be aware of that empty sleeve. And so we need to be more sensitive to those empty sleeves, because they may be hidden away in the lives of other people. And then the second lesson to learn from this story is that our hard, condemning judgments can boomerang. They can come back to haunt us. And in the end, they end up revealing far more about us than they reveal about the one that we're judging. I have one final thought. That thought is that judgment belongs to God. When Jesus is saying, do not judge, he's reminding us that the judgment belongs to God and not to us. Judgment is God's job, not ours, and we need to be thankful for that, because it means that ultimately we're not going to be judged by other people. We are judged by the one person who knows us and understands us, who loves us, by the one who knows the whole truth about us, and the one who knows all about the empty sleeves in our lives. If we could, by the grace of God, give up harsh, condemning judgments of others for Lent this year, hopefully, prayerfully, we can give up this bad and hurtful practice forever. Will you guys pray with me? Dear God, thank you for reminding us about the dangers of rumors and gossip. Help us to refrain from judgment and explain the actions of others in the kindest ways. May we treat others the way that we wish to be treated. Amen. Okay, so I have some questions that I want you to think about, okay? And I have these printed out, so if anybody ever wants copies of this, all you got to do is come by the church and you can get them. First question, what stories do you know about the way rumors have hurt people? What are some of the ways that rumors start, and what are some of the dangers of spreading gossip? I think we all probably have either had a rumor started by us or started about us somewhere in our lives. And we know that it hurts. Nobody wants to hear things about themselves, especially when they're not true. So why do you think, this is question 2, why do you think that Jesus gives us such a strong warning against judging others? It's a good question. Why is he telling us so strongly not to do it? Question 3. How do you respond to the 4 questions that the Rotary Club gives as a guide for judging whether or not to pass along information? And also the one that I shared with our youth group. If everyone would ask these questions, how might our culture and our world be different? Oh boy, it would be so different. So different. If people would think before they speak, if they would make sure they had the facts. So important. I mean, think about the young girl, Ellen. What if the neighbor across the street had bothered to just go over and talk to the parents and say, hey, I saw your daughter coming home late with some strange guy, what's going on? None of it would have happened. But she didn't. She saw what she thought she saw, and she probably told her kid or, somebody else, and it just went gangbusters from there. And it ended up costing a young girl her life. Things could have been totally different if she just would have stopped and asked those questions. Question 4, think about a time that you were either on the giving or receiving end of an unkind remark. How did it feel? What did you think? And what happened as a result of that unkind remark? If you've never seen the movie Pretty Woman, there's a part in it where Richard Gere is talking to Julia Roberts and talking about, what a great person she is and why does she think so badly of herself. And she says something so profound. When you hear the bad stuff over and over again, it just makes it a lot easier to believe. When you hear those bad things about yourself and you hear it often, you start to believe it about yourself. And so we need to think about that before we make those unkind remarks. But on the same token, we need to remember, if we're on the receiving end of that unkind remark, that while the bad stuff may be easier to believe, the good stuff is what the truth is. And that in God's eyes, we're perfect. And any mistakes that we've made in the past don't matter at all. Question 5. What are some examples of how judgments may boomerang? And what are some of the consequences? I know I've made snap judgments, and it's come back to bite me in the butt. And, I was embarrassed, much like that teacher. Now, I never did anything quite that bad. But, I've made comments and had it get back to somebody, and they called me to the carpet on it, and I deserved it. So think about consequences of your statements. Question 6, and that's our last question for tonight. Why do you think we should leave judgment of others to God and God alone? Because He's the only one that matters. Plain and simple. You're going to make friends, you're going to make enemies throughout your whole life. But the only person that matters, the only judgment that matters, is the one that comes from God. Plain and simple. So each week I'm going to give you a focus. And so this week I want you to focus on watching what you say about others. Remember that silence is often golden. Offer encouragement and kind words when possible. Practice giving sympathy to others this week. And I invite you to start a new habit of sharing good news. All right, guys. Well, that's it for tonight. I hope you enjoyed. If you popped in late, don't worry about it. You can catch it from the beginning. It'll be posted here to Facebook and all of that here in a few minutes. And I will see you next week. Don't forget, our Bible study is on Mondays at 11 a.m. or 6 p.m. 11 a.m. in person, 6 p.m. is in person or live, depending on who all shows up. Okay? All right. Good night, everybody.